morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all here bright and early this morning. My name's Doug Edworthy. I'm standing in for the lovely Helen Goddard, who some of you who were here yesterday probably know is unwell. Poor lady's had a double dose of flu and has now got tonsillitis, so she's obviously not fit to be here. She's very disappointed to miss today. But myself and two other colleagues from the ISC Council have agreed to stand in her stead to introduce the three seminars that we've got today. I think Phil gave you a quick rundown on what we're doing today. We're just about to hear from Dr. Chris Cocking on the Busting the Myths of Mass Evacuation. Then at 11:30 we've got the Warren Barnett Memorial Lecture on how do we react to sound, and then in the afternoon at 2:30 we've got a lecture called Don't Drop the Ball. A reminder that Phil has asked me to give after the session. Please do go into the exhibition for your coffees. There's plenty of time before the next seminar. Well, I'm going to introduce Dr. Chris Cocking, who's doing our Hopkins-Baldwin lecture. David Hopkins and Terry Baldwin were two lights of the ISCE for many years. Both of them held the position of president. They're both sorely missed, and we thought in their honour we would set up this annual lecture to remember them by. So this is Dr. Chris Cocking, who's going to lecture us on the Busting the Myths of Mass Evacuation. He's senior lecturer at the School of Health Sciences, University of Brighton, from Sussex, where I come from, best county in the world. This seminar will focus on the research carried out by Chris and his colleagues into crowd behaviour during emergencies and the implications for crowd safety management during mass evacuations. A commonly held view is that during emergencies people are prone to panic, and so crowd management strategies have traditionally been based on fears of the possible irrational and/or selfish behaviour that might result from any mass panic. However, research has proved that the idea of mass panic is largely a myth, and it's not supported by detailed investigation of what people actually do during crowd evacuations. People tend to behave cooperatively during evacuations if they're physically able to do so, even during crowd flight, and any risks associated are usually related to crowd density and/or people delaying egress because they're unaware of the threat or how to act upon such a threat. During emergencies, it's best to provide as much relevant information as possible on how people can evacuate effectively and/or keep themselves safe from danger. Voice alarm systems have a clear role to play in this process. However, it's not simply about providing information at a higher decibel level than the panicking crowd, and it's vital that any information is delivered in a confident and consistent manner in a way that's trusted by the recipients of the message, if people are going to be able to act upon information provided and keep themselves safe. Dr. Cocking is Senior Lecturer at the School of Health Sciences, University of Brighton, with a research interest in the psychology of crowd behaviour, particularly during mass emergencies, collective resilience and post-disaster psychosocial support. Together with colleagues, he's developed the social identity model of crowd resilience, which argues that outdated and often flawed irrational discourses about crowds can contribute to crowd management, emergency planning and responses that could create further problems and increase risks to public safety. Chris has worked in the crowd management sector, consulting on crowd behaviour at large events in the southeast of England. He also advises on emergency planning and has been a visiting speaker at the Cabinet Office Emergency Planning College. Other consultations he's provided have been for the London Resilience Team, part of the Government Office for London, and the Greater London Assembly, where he contributed to their report on the 7/7 terrorist bombings. Along with colleagues, he's had his research findings published in over 20 publications in academic and applied journals and user reports, including most recently a case study by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction Scientific and Technical Advisory Group. The UN do love their snappy titles, don't they? Chris, over to you.
Thanks. You kind of paraphrased myself. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm basically, I suppose, I'm what you call the academic equivalent of an ambulance chaser. Can you all hear me all right, by the way? Let me know if you can't. As has been explained, what me and colleagues do is we spent most of our career trying to undo a lot of the myths about crowds, trying to rehabilitate them, because crowds are often seen as this thing to be feared. And the irony of our research is often when people are trying to get away from crowd events, be it crowd disorder or crowd emergencies, we're the ones running in going, let's have a look, let's check this out. But it does get us into some quite interesting work. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is how the context of the study of crowd behaviour has come about, because there is a history to it, and the way that crowds have been viewed and studied has changed over time. I would say for the better as well, because it's now much more evidence-based. I'll give you a brief intro into the particular research that I've done into crowd behaviour in emergencies, but then I'll try and focus on what hopefully will be useful for you as practitioners, is the implications for crowd safety management, because as was introduced earlier, however well one's physical delivery is, and there's some excellent systems, I saw some just wandering through earlier today, how people engage and relate with them is a psychological issue that has to be considered as well, as well as the fantastic kit and technology that clearly we can produce. So that's what we're focusing on. Where do we start then with the study of crowd behaviour? Historically, as I said, crowds were traditionally seen as very irrational. There was a very deep irrationalist tradition of crowds, that they were to be feared. Crowds are either bad because they do bad things, they go rioting, pillaging, looting, etc., or they're mad, and this is in emergencies. People can't be trusted to behave well. It's this cliche that if you stand in a crowded room and shout fire, people will trample over their own granny to get out in this mass stampede. And so these irrationalist traditions were very, very deeply held, which, as a researcher, I think is problematic because there's almost no evidence at all to support the notions. But there are some deeply held notions, and I draw very heavily, particularly in my blog, I have a real debt to Clive Dunn and Corporal Jones from Dad's Army, because I think he typifies very well the kind of traditionalist panic model notion, whereas the slightest thing goes wrong in Dad's Army, he's running around going, don't panic, when it's clear he's actually the only one who's panicking in that situation. So the premises of the panic model are that if you're faced with a threat, if you're in an emergency, you will become fearful. That in itself is fairly commonsensical, but what it also says, which is more problematic, is this fear will cause your emotion to then overwhelm your reason, which means that you can no longer make reasonable or sensible choices because you are so fearful. It also assumes that any collective identity that you have breaks down, and you then start exhibiting selfish behaviours, such as the cliche of trampling over one's granny to get out, pushing and shoving to get out of situations like that. And then a final premise of the panic model is the notion of contagion, which draws upon almost medical, pathological explanations, this idea that if you sneeze, everyone catches a cold, and the analogy goes to crowd behaviour, that if someone starts doing something selfish or irrational or antisocial, everybody else will join in, and behaviours will spread completely uncritically through the crowd as a whole. Now, these notions were very deeply held until relatively recently, and as I said, that is problematic because pretty much all three of those notions, there's very little, if any, evidence at all to support any of the premises, and I would say there's a lot of evidence that actually shows the opposite, which I will explain in more detail in my research. So this isn't just a semantic thing, though. You know, as I said, I'm really passionate about my academic work actually having a change in the real world, and there are implications to having a panic model. If, as a crowd manager, the way that you plan and respond to emergencies is predicated on the panic model, there are implications. The most significant one is that you then see emergencies as a potential public order problem rather than a public safety problem. And this has a real impact on crowd management strategies. The most classic tragic example of that, I would say, is the Hillsborough disaster, because there's reams and reams of evidence to now show that one of the major factors of how the disaster started started and how it got much, much worse and wasn't stopped in time was because the police wrongly assumed that there was crowd disorder, i.e. there was a pitch invasion when there wasn't. And that, I think, is one of the classic tragic examples. So it really does guide your emergency planning if you think that crowds will behave in a certain way. It's also got particular implications for emergencies as well, because if you think that crowds are going to panic if there's a threat, then you're going to withhold information from them. You're going to think, well, we probably shouldn't tell them about the threat because then we'll be faced with a stampede. And I spend a lot of time working with emergency planners to try to undo that myth, because I think it is a myth. There's actually very, very little evidence to support the idea. And withholding information can actually cause problems because it delays people taking action to keep themselves and their families safe, such as evacuating. It also means that crowds are seen as a problem rather than a possible resource. And I'll give some examples later of how crowds in emergencies can actually be used as a resource by the emergency services to keep themselves and other people safe. There are quite useful things that crowds can do if they're trusted to do it. This still here, just so you know the context, it's a police officer in full CBRN kit. It's a still from a training video for the emergency services of how you deal with an emergency response. And I would say in CBRN responses, and talking of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear attacks, dirty bombs, nuclear devices going off, if you have members of the emergency services dressed like that, that's not going to help the situation. It's going to increase crowd anxiety because people are going to see that and it's going to make them more fearful. But also, unless that kit actually has a radio inside where the people can communicate effectively, it's very, very difficult to hear what anybody is saying if they've got a full CBRN mask on. We would say if there's any health emergencies, such as there's the release of contaminants, the dirty bomb, etc., it's far more important to have health professionals there on the ground talking to people, doctors and nurses, saying you need to stay here, you need to be decontaminated, etc. That message is much more likely to be listened to because the crucial thing is the relationship between the giver of the information and the recipient. And this is a point I will be coming back to a lot. So there are a lot of problems then with the panic model. Chiefly, as I said, there's pretty much no evidence to support it. There's been studies of varieties of different emergencies throughout the years and found that mass panic is actually noticeable by its absence. And 9/11, which is probably one of the most researched emergencies in history, because of where it happened and because of the time and because of kind of in New York there's a cultural bias where people are happy to talk about their experiences more so than perhaps they would be in London, etc. So they've done massive studies of it, and one of the biggest ones where they looked at the tens of thousands of different reported behaviours. And of those reported behaviours, they found that less than 1% of them could be considered as selfish or irrational or panics. The vast majority of the behaviours were more pro-social. It's not to say that there weren't any behaviours at all that were problematic, but what tended to happen was rather than those behaviours spreading, people would intervene. So there were reports of people pushing on the stairwells on the World Trade Centres when they were evacuated. And this was rare and this was minor. But what tended to happen was that people would say, no, stop pushing, you need to wait your time, you need to wait your turn in line, rather than everybody then going, oh, if I don't push, I'm going to die as well, and then you ending up with a mass stampede. Where I think the use of panic sometimes is less problematic, I think is this good quote by a colleague, Professor Keith Still, who works in crowd modelling, and he argues that if you're going to talk about panic, you should use it in terms of the distress and things that people may be experiencing in the incident rather than that panic is causing people to die. So his quote is, people don't die because of panic, they might panic because people are dying. If they see people around them, they may then become distressed and fearful rather than their behaviour causes the problems. Okay, so the model that we created then, we shortened to SIMCA, the Social Identity Model of Collective Resilience. What we would say is that disasters create a common identity in response to a shared threat. It's the notion of that if something happens, people tend to feel united. They tend to come together and go, well, actually, we're all in this together. And that increases safe group evacuation. If people cooperate, group evacuation is usually more successful than if people behave individualistically. So it argues that people that people behave altruistically, and people tend to be cooperative. We're not saying that there is no selfish behaviour at all, but the norm tends to be cooperative, and if people don't cooperate, it's usually because of physical constraints. So, for example, if you look at crowd crush disasters like the Hillsborough disaster, if you have a situation where there's very, very high crowd density and people are squashed together, they may not physically be able to even move their arms, and in some really bad situations, people are even not lifted off the ground by the pressure of the crowd. In that situation, it's physically very, very difficult to do anything to help other people, other than perhaps to psychologically comfort people. And that, I would say, explains lack of cooperation much more than any inherent selfish behaviour. So what kind of research have we done? We did a study into the London bombings in 7/7 to look at the behaviours of what was going on. We reckon we got data from about 5% of the 3,000 people that were directly affected by the 3 explosions on the tube and the 1 explosion on a bus. What we found was clearly there was fear and distress in individuals, but there was no mass panic. People often talked about how surprised they were that there wasn't panic, and people often say, I was surprised how quiet it was and how cooperative people were. And we found that there were general norms of calm cooperation. And people often spontaneously talked about the social bonds that were actually created through the event. And the particularly interesting thing, especially about the explosions on the tube, is that before 7/7 happened, we were asked by the media in a kind of hypothetical question, in what situations do you think mass panic could happen? And we thought about it, and we thought, well, if you have a situation where you have a physical mass of people, but there's no psychological connection between them at all, and they don't cooperate, then maybe in that situation you might be more likely to get mass panic. And we thought about it and thought, what situation is that? And we thought, well, actually, a crowded tube train in rush hour, there's minimal psychological connection between people. Nobody talks to each other on the tube. People look at their iPads or read the Metro. If someone talks to you, you tend to look away. And what happened on 7/7 was that you very quickly found that a physical mass of people became a psychological crowd very quickly. Almost as soon as explosions happened, people started talking to each other, they started cooperating, they started comforting people, comforting the injured, looking for people with first aid training. So I think that is a very, very good example of how a physical crowd very quickly becomes a psychological crowd. Okay, I'll move now on to management of venues, because there's clear implications for this of kind of how you manage events. And one thing that often gets my goat in the reporting of events, this is partly why I created a blog to kind of undo a lot of the myths that are often propagated in the media, is that when there's a tragedy in a venue, say a fire in a nightclub, that the reports of it are usually misrepresenting the behaviour. They usually talk about mass panic, they usually talk about stampedes and things like that. But detailed examination of what goes on almost never backs up those original claims. And what I would say is the term panic is often used to deflect blame away from the possible venue mismanagement. And you have this tragic irony that the victims of disasters are often characterised as the villains. Yeah, the disaster happened because people panicked. And some of them, I'm thinking there was a fire in a nightclub in Brazil in 2013. As soon as it happened, people were talking about panic, stampede and things like that. And then they looked at it and realised there was actually only one working fire exit for a club that was quite a few levels up on a packed building. And the bouncers were not letting people leave until they'd finished their drinks because they didn't want them stealing the glasses. And so the vast majority of casualties appeared to be because people couldn't evacuate in time. It was nothing to do with a stampede or panic. More recently, there was a fire in a hospital in South Korea, and fires in hospitals are interesting because they're very, very rare, and usually they're very, very successful because there's a hierarchy of doctors, nurses, and it's very easy to wheel beds out into different areas. If there are tragedies, it's often because of a failure of infrastructure. So, for example, the fire in the hospital in South Korea appeared to be because there were no sprinklers working in the venue at the time. Okay, so as I said, a lot of my work is correcting common misconceptions. One of the common misconceptions, for example, is when there's reports of stampede, it's the idea that people were pushing and then people fell over because they were pushing. Pushing in crowd evacuations is usually unintentional. What happens, though, in crowds is if you get very, very high density levels, you sometimes get pressure surges going through the crowd, which is where people are no longer physically able to stop themselves moving forward because because of the sheer density. And in really, really packed crowds, sometimes people even get lifted off the ground. In that situation, you can see pressure surging through crowds quite clearly, but that's an unintentional thing. It's not to do with any selfish behaviour. There's also a difference between what's called a crowd crush or a collapse and a stampede. So, for example, the Hillsborough disaster could be seen as a crowd crush, but there's been other situations. I'm thinking recently of there was an incident at Parsons Green when there was a device that went off on a tube train and people evacuated down the stairs. In that situation, if someone falls over, you could then get a domino effect. And again, I would say that's to do with physical pressure rather than that there's any deliberate trampling over people when they fall down. Because the work that I've done on flights, I've looked at how crowds flee when there's crowd surges, when they flee a threat. It's very, very rare for people to deliberately trample on others, and if they're able to, they're much more likely to actually stop and pick people up. So again, the notion of people stampeding and trampling away is just not supported by the evidence. Okay, so some interesting things that have happened recently around the notion of false alarms. We had, for example, in Hawaii, that text message went out to everyone in the area with a cell phone, and when people took action to keep themselves safe, i.e. running to nuclear shelters, it was then characterised as mass panic. Which I think is very problematic because it's very easy if you're an outside observer to talk about the situations as panic if you're not involved in it. Those people at the time did not know it was a mistake, and at the bottom you see it says this is not a drill. So how would you know if that pings off on your phone and you're on a beach in Hawaii whether the message is true or not? So it's not only unfair on people to say, oh, you're panicking in that situation because you don't have the benefit of hindsight, but there's a problem that in real emergencies, in future, people might then disregard the message. They might think, oh, well, that happened before and it was a mistake, so it's probably a mistake this time, which is really problematic when you have a real emergency because it means people are not taking action to keep themselves safe. There's an interesting thing that sometimes happens with sound as well. So the bottom picture is a still from... There were two evacuations of Los Angeles LAX airport and JFK airport in New York last year because there were mistaken reports of shooters and then people evacuated the airport. And again, this was reported as panic. But in that particular context, it's not unexpected in the situation for people to believe certain rumours and think that the rumour is credible. And again, it's not panic. We also had it in Oxford Circus, which is the middle still, where there was a fight on a crowded tube platform, and people thought it was a terrorist attack. And so the tube station was evacuated, and you had Russell Brand and Ollie Murs tweeting from inside, I think, Selfridges, going, oh, there's a terrorist attack, and they were castigated in the media. But again, if you're in that situation and you don't know better, it's not an unreasonable assumption to draw, especially if you then see armed police on the streets. So that is problematic as well, if people don't believe false alarms in future. Okay, before I get on to the practical implications, there's also the issue of politics of resilience. Now, I talk a lot about resilience, and I think it's a very useful term to use, but there are also problems with it, especially when I hear politicians using the word resilience. Often winds me up because they rarely know what they're talking about. But I would say that there still is an assumption of vulnerability. However much politicians say, oh, Britain's very resilient and things like that, I still think there is an assumption underneath that people are vulnerable, and if you have the right situations, then they'll still be faced with mass panic. There's also resource issues as well, because there is a danger of, if you assume that everyone was resilient, that could then be used politically to cut back on resources, which again I would completely reject, because people can only behave resiliently if they're given the information and the resources to do. If you cut the funds, if you cut the budgets, you cut the information campaigns to explain to people this is how you behave resiliently, then it's much less likely to happen. I would also say as well is that the resilience doesn't mean that people aren't distressed, they don't suffer quite damaging events, and some people can be psychologically traumatized afterwards. Not saying that at all, but resilience means that people can bounce back or sometimes even forward if they're given the resources to do so. So most people do endure, and the proportion of people that are psychologically traumatized in the aftermath is usually rare. It's usually between about 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 people of terrorist attacks, for example, develop PTSD afterwards. So the majority of people don't. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is answer what I call the okay, but so what question. Often when I do these talk to practitioners, people will listen and they'll go, okay, Chris, that's great, but how can what you've told us today be useful in actually ensuring crowd safety? So these are some kind of examples where I hope it might be useful, but please do come and get me either after this or later on. I'm around for the rest of the day if you have specific questions about how my research might be useful in your field of work. The main thing is planning. Planning emergency response is crucial. It's very, very easy to become complacent and to not have training exercises and to not train people thinking, oh, it won't happen to us. It could happen to anybody, and so planning needs to be done. Staff involved in venue location and venue management need to be knowledgeable of the situation, and they need to know how to relay information effectively in emergencies. So when I work, for example, with training stewards, we work a lot on how do you effectively deliver messages to crowds. It's not just the information itself, which is important, but how do you then get the people to engage with the information you're giving them as well? A little thing, you shouldn't say don't panic. It's just not a useful thing to say. First of all, people don't panic, so what's the point in telling them not to do something they're not going to do anyway? But it could create this bizarre expectation where people think, well, should I be panicking? Is there something I should be panicking about? Are you being completely straight with me, and are you telling me everything? So it could actually foster distrust, because it might make people think, is there something you're not telling me and I should be panicking? Practice really does make a difference as well. So, for example, what's not hugely widely known outside of emergency planning areas is that 9/11 was actually the second attack on the World Trade Center towers. There was a smaller attempt in 1993 where car bombs were placed in the car park. In that situation, it took over 2 hours to evacuate both World Trade Center buildings. What they did, though, after 1993 was they practiced and they practiced again evacuations. So on 9/11, they managed to evacuate the buildings in 45 minutes. So clearly it was a tragedy for the 2,500 people who died that day, but it actually was a very, very efficient evacuation because 99% of the people who below where the planes hit got out. Most of the people who perished were the people who were above the planes who had no chance of getting out, or emergency service personnel, firefighters, police officers who went up into the building to help people. They were by far the majority of the casualties. So it was actually a very successful evacuation. Information is crucial. We would say wherever possible, give as much information as you can, unless there's a very, very good reason for not giving information. And I do struggle to think of situations where you shouldn't give information. There's very little evidence to show that people panic if they're made aware of a threat. Now, obviously, this is a very difficult area to research because in academia we have ethics committees and they get very nervous about you saying, the research I'm going to do is I'm going to run into a crowded theatre, start a fire and shout, fire, get out. You know, no ethics committee would clear that kind of research. However, the research that has been done on emergency PA systems, there was one done in the Newcastle Metro, they found that giving people information and clear information rather than just an alarm going off resulted in the most efficient evacuation and the quickest evacuation. So it is useful to give information. Use of code words is quite a hot topic in the stewarding and security industry. I used to work with people in the security sector, and they have loads of different code words, which I'm sure you're familiar with, so I won't go into detail of what they are. And there are some good reasons for keeping professional composure. But I used to say to the emergency planners I work with, having a particular word to say on the radio rather than the word fire is not in itself going to stop panic. So, for example, if you shout fire down a walkie-talkie and members of the public hear it, it's not going to cause a stampede, but then again, I don't think it's a good idea to stand in a crowded venue and just shout fire, because it's not very useful information. You're not telling people the specifics of the threat, where the threat is, and what they have to do to escape the threat. If you give them very detailed, specific information, for example, there's a small fire in point A, please move slowly and calmly to points B, C, and D, and follow the advice of the stewards in high vis on the ground, that will engender a much more successful evacuation. Because if people are given information in clear ways that they can act upon, they usually tend to act upon it. if you deliberately withhold information, and I'm pleased to say this is happening much, much less than used to be common practice, and the emergency services have pretty much got the message that it's not a good idea to deliberately withhold information. But if you do, it could not only delay the evacuation at that particular point, because people may not be aware of the threat, but it could also cause you problems in future emergencies, because people might then go in a future emergency, how do we know you'll be completely open with us? Because in the last situation, I heard that people weren't told about the threat. So it's problematic in two ways. Now, this I like to use as a very good example of good information delivery. Hurricane Katrina was a massive disaster for New Orleans. Many thousands of people perished, and there was a lot of flack directed at the emergency services and the emergency planning. The next hurricane to hit New Orleans afterwards, this was the message given by Ray Nagin, the mayor of New Orleans, to get out. And I think it's particularly interesting, not just because he says you need to get your butts moving out of New Orleans now. What he's doing is he's saying you do need to be scared, but you do need to take action. And he's giving people very specific information. He's telling them where to go, what time, and how long they have to do it. And that resulted in a very, very efficient evacuation, and there were very, very few casualties after the next hurricane to hit New Orleans. So I think that's a very good example of information delivery. Okay. It's not just a physical matter, though, of having PA systems louder than noise of panicking crowds. I was talking to colleagues at dinner last night, and there was some sort of amusing moments where people couldn't hear what was going on in the tannoy. Clearly, tannoys need to be good enough so people can physically hear what the information is. But even if it's completely crystal clear and it comes out loud, people still need to engage with the source of the information. So it needs to be clear, it needs to be unambiguous, and delivered confidently and come from a credible source. So there's an interesting discussion about do you do automated messages? So, for example, if there's a tube evacuation, there'll be a ping, and then there'll be a pre-recorded delivered message. That can be useful for giving a degree of confidence and authority, but it might mean that people might think, well, that could just be an automatic thing generated. It could be a mistake. So there's a debate about whether or not you should have messages in live, real time of designated people saying, oh, this is my name, I am the Chief Evacuation Officer of London Underground, it is important that you leave. I think introducing that in would be more likely to make people engage with the message. However, the type of the message varies with audiences, and so what you have to think about is what relationship does the crowd have with the deliverer of the message. And this is used a lot, for example, at football matches, because they found in situations, especially if there'd been conflict between fans and the police, where sometimes when the police addressed the crowd and they gave them information that was actually true and accurate, the crowd didn't believe them because of previously historical conflictual relations. So what they tend to do now is they have stewards or representatives of the fans standing up to the crowd and going, no, this information is true, you do need to act upon it. And this often will vary with the crowd, but it's something to be considered as well. What they do in gigs often is if they have to do a show stop, which is to stop the show, they'll get a member of the band to do it because the crowd identify with the band, and if the lead singer says, look, I'm really sorry, we've got to stop the gig, people are more likely to listen to that than, say, if some random security guard comes on and says, show stops now. So you need to think about who and the relationship they have. And being aware of the local context as well is crucial. Okay, now there's a concept that's talked about, which we've explored a lot in emergencies, which is the concept of zero responders. And it's the idea that no matter how good an emergency evacuation response by the emergency services, and there's always ways to improve it, no response is instantaneous. So I think the first ambulances were on scene within less than 15 minutes on 7/7, which is pretty good. But in that time, there will always be a delay because the emergency services do not know when an emergency is going to happen. They can't be there on scene. So the people who are the first people able to respond are usually bystanders or people who are affected by the incident but haven't been injured. And rather than being too shocked to act, they often do intervene and help each other. And so, for example, this happened at the Manchester Arena attack. Parents were helping out children that weren't their own. There was a very moving account on Channel 4 News of some parents who actually were helping injured children before they'd even found their own children. And so that kind of thing, I think, can be used. This refers to what I talked about earlier about the crowd being a possible resource. Ways of doing that can be encouraged. And it's a question that we often ask ourselves is how can we encourage and facilitate zero responders? Another good example is when there's prolonged incidents such as sieges, like at the Nairobi Mall in 2013 when there was an al-Shabaab terrorist attack, if there's a delay in the emergency services getting in, the people within the incident can serve a vital role in saving people's lives, such as directing people to safety, which is what the photo in the bottom is people directing people out and so they can escape danger. So the role of zero responders, I think, is crucial, and how you consider that is something to be encouraged. Okay, so I'll finish with my general conclusions now, and if anyone has any questions, either now or later, please do come and get me. I suppose the basic take-home message is that crowds behave much better than expected, and the concept of mass panic is basically a myth. So panic models should not be used in emergency planning. Selfish behaviour, if it does happen, it's usually located within individuals, so the problem is usually an individual problem, and it rarely spreads. What is more likely to happen is that other people will intervene and say, no, don't do that, that's not going to help, it's okay, calm down, you're going to be okay, you don't need to behave like that. There are risks associated with crowds, because tragedies like Hillsborough do show that crowds can be dangerous, but these are usually due to physical restraints or the lack of information, rather than any inherent irrationality or selfishness. And so if we can encourage that, we can only help make crowds better, safer. Okay, so thank you for listening, and does anyone have any questions or comments?
I think we've got time for perhaps two questions, but I'm mindful of the fact that we'd like you to get you out to the exhibition and then get you back in time for the next session. So we'll have a couple of questions. Sorry, I just did see somebody's hand go up before yours, Peter.
Hi. In your experience, if there's a noisy environment to start with and there's an incident where an alarm goes off and a message has to be received, do crowds naturally attenuate their noise at that point because they hear an alarm, or does that carry on? Because sometimes you might have an issue with actually getting the alarm to be loud enough so that it was over the level of whatever was the noisy activity that was going on to start with.
It depends upon the crowd, but yes, generally, if people think that there's an important reason for them to pay attention, they will. An example I can think of, and it might be slightly tangential, is this year's Notting Hill Carnival. They planned to have a minute's silence for Grenfell at one point, and I was really interested to see if that happens, because you would think, Notting Hill Carnival, it's really, really loud, there's no way you'll get the crowd to fall silent. I was amazed by how silent people became when the area that they were going to have the minute's silence in honour of Grenfell, that actually did happen, and people did go very quiet, and it was quite eerie. So yes, people can attenuate their volume. I suppose the crucial thing is people need to have a reason to do it. They need to understand there's an important incident for them to do that. But yes, if you can persuade them to do it, they will.
Another question? I think Peter got his hand up slightly before yours, Neil.
I put mine up before I started clapping.
All right.
I don't mind it.
In that case, I'll take an executive decision and say there's two further questions. One from Peter. Peter, you go
Peter,
first.
do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. I just wondering if there's any cultural differences you've come across between the way crowds behave. In America, Latin America, or the step up of British and England.
It's a question I often get asked, and it's an area that we do need to look at more, but the more we look, the less differences we find. There might be some cultural nuances, but say, for example, Keith Still, the colleague I mentioned earlier, he's done a lot of work at the pilgrimage of the Hajj in Mecca and Medina, and he's found that there are similar issues and problems there, and sometimes there's cultural variations to do with the practices of what one does when one goes on the pilgrimage, to do with stoning the pillars and the aspects of it. So you do need to be aware of specific things that go with on that, but it's actually, there's remarkable commonalities that go throughout pretty much most human cultures. So I would say it's largely a universal trait, the kind of cooperation. But yes, one has to be mindful of cultural norms. The idea of this British stiff upper lip is interesting as well, because we found there's a kind of rhetorical nature after emergencies, and this happened after 9/11, it happened after 7/7. It's politicians and the media will always say things like, New Yorkers can take it, London can take it, London had the Blitz, London had the IRA bombing campaign, but if it happened somewhere else, if it happened in Paris or Brussels, then you'd see panic, and then incidents happen there and you don't. So it's a kind of way, it's a rhetorical device of saying, okay, panic didn't happen here, but it would happen somewhere else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. As the designer and maker, I'm interested.
Yeah, I can give you the links to the stuff on Mecca. There's some really interesting work on that.
Do you think it's harder to reach younger people in the public space because unless it actually appears on their phone, they don't think it's a fact?
There could be particular issues with young crowds, and after the Manchester Arena attack, it is something that's been considered. In terms of the immediate physical response, the video footage I saw inside Manchester Arena of how the crowds behaved, it was largely similar to how an adult crowd would behave, perhaps more fear and distress and a higher level of screaming. But in terms of the crowd surge, people tended to happen in the same way. Where you might have problems, and I know crowd planners and event managers, the thing they moan about worse, they say the most difficult gigs for them to police are gigs like Ed Sheeran gigs. Which sounds a bit counterintuitive. You think, why would Ed Sheeran fans cause trouble? It's not that they cause trouble, but they're often quite young. What they want to do is they want to rush to the front and they want to see Ed. And they don't have experience of crowds and they don't know what are the norms of behaviour. So that can cause problems because they might put themselves into risky situations where they're not actually, because they're less experienced of being in crowds. But the crucial thing there would be just education to say, look, it's not a good idea, for example, as soon as you get in the venue, just to rush straight to the front and all squash up there, because it won't be a fun experience, and you might end up being pulled out of the crowd by the end because of heat exhaustion and things like that. So perhaps some, but less than one might think, and I think that can be overcome by education. Okay.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much indeed for that talk. That was extremely interesting, and for people involved in providing the equipment and the systems to get people out of places in emergency, the information you've given us is a really useful addition to our knowledge on that. So thank you very much indeed. So a round of applause, please, for Chris. And just to remind you that coffee is being served in the exhibition tent. Please go in there and be back for the next session, which starts at 11:30.